Hey guys, Fox here, and today we're going to be doing the XFL 3.0 2023 Midseason review. Now, if you haven't seen the Week 1 review, you can click the top right of the video and you'll be able to go watch that video, so as this is only going to cover Weeks 2 through 5. So we're going to talk about overall how was the attendance, how are the games being presented, certain things about them, viewing, all that kind of jazz. So without further ado, let's just get into how the games did by themselves. In Week 2, the first game, the Battlehawks and Sea Dragons had a 10,000 fan attendance at Lumen Field and was viewed by over 500,000 people. Then you had the Defenders versus the Vipers, which had 6,000 people at Cashman Field with 600,000 people watching. Then you had the San Antonio Brahmas versus the Orlando Guardians in front of 12,000 people at Camping World Stadium. That was in front of 780,000 people. Then the Renegades at the Roughnecks at TDECU Stadium was played in front of 11,700 people and was watched by 680,000. Then in Week 3, you had the Dragons versus the Vipers at Cashman Field to 6,000 people again, and then it was viewed by just over 500,000 people. Then you had the Battlehawks versus the Defenders at Audi Field with an attendance of 16,000 at Audi Field and was watched by 670,000 people. Then the Guardians at the Renegades at Choctaw Stadium had 12,000 people in attendance with 550,000 viewers. And then the last game of Week 3, the Brahmas versus the Roughnecks at TDECU Stadium had 11,000 people watching with 540,000 people watching. Then we go into Week 4. In terms of Week 4, the Roughnecks versus the Guardians at Camping World Stadium was played in just barely above 10,000 people and was viewed by 400,000 people. Then you had the Brahmas at the Sea Dragons at Lumen Field, which had 15,000 people watching in attendance and 340,000 watching on TV. Then the Renegades at the Battlehawks at the Dome at America Center had the spring football record since the 90s in 38,000 people in attendance and was viewed by 570,000 people. Then the Vipers at the Defenders at Audi Field had a halfway to 12,000 but 11,500 people watching in attendance in front of 690,000 people on TV. Then in Week 5, we had a couple games that had schedule changes due to the higher-ups wanting to have these games air at different times and networks. So you had one game that started an hour and a half later, but was on ESPN in the Roughnecks versus the Dragons at Lumen Field. They had just over 9,000 people at attendance and was watched by only 260,000 people. The Defenders versus the Battlehawks, that game was at the Dome at America Center and had 35,868 people in attendance and was watched by 320,000 people. Then you had the Guardians versus the Vipers at Cashman Field. This was played in 8 above 6,000 people and 230,000 people watched the game. Then the last one was also switched. This one was scheduled for 10 p.m. but was moved to 9 p.m. And the Renegades played the Brahmas at the Almadome. This was in front of 13,000 people with 250,000 people viewing it. So those are the overall attendance and, viewership numbers for them. So before I go into the actual statistics, I just want to give my thoughts on the broadcast, having, watched a lot of these games. In my opinion, I think that overall the broadcast is okay. I don't think it's really that good. I think that the fact is they've tried to do a lot of copying to the USFL, which in some senses is a good idea. The Replay Command Center is a great thing to do. The USFL proved that it was a great addition last year, and I do like that addition this year. But their all-access has been disappointing. The USFL would do it where they basically go into the drive of the offensive mind. So it was always the head coach and the quarterback were always mic'd up talking, and you'd hear the announcers talk very little during that. The XFL, however, they did it to where you'd hear the OC, the DC, the announcers, and the quarterback all have their mics on at the same time. Now, also, you have the random muting that happens. It's gotten better as the week's gone on, but the muting is basically due to, the Disney overlord not letting, curse words be on there, kind of like, YouTube. So you end up having these random muted sections which take away from the broadcast completely. And when you have too many people talking at once, sometimes it gets a bit it gets too cluttered. And so overall, I think that they've done this in a poor way. I like the idea, but you either have to only let the OC and DC talk or do some sort of thing where you just use the audio from the DC just a couple seconds later. It's just for a few weeks it was really bad and it's been okay. I also don't like the over talk about gambling. It makes it feel like that this league is purely about betting on it rather than what it's supposed to be, which is, as The Rock would say, the player 54s of the world, and more like the, gamblers of the world. They talk about the over under the favorites all the time and it's way too much. They need to stop doing it. That's supposed to be just something you get to do, not something that's the most important thing about it. Those are overall, I think, my biggest critiques of the broadcast. I think that aside from that, I think it's solid. The replay command center, like I said, is a great way to bring back something from the USFL. I do wish they had actual halftimes instead of just showing you random clips or the announcers talking. The way the USFL had actual halftime stuff was definitely better. It makes it feel more professional or more real versus just kind of having no one talk, making it feel like a true lesser product. So those are what I would say in terms of the broadcast and my opinions. So now let's go talk about some stats and the TV ratings. Now, in terms of the TV ratings, the ratings from weeks 2 through 5, we had 9 games on FX, 5 on ESPN2, and 2 on ESPN. The XFL didn't have any games through these weeks on ABC for literally no reason. So how did these games do? Well, naturally, as you saw, they kept on going down in ratings week after week, but overall, they've all actually averaged kind of about the same. ESPN2 surprisingly averaged the most, but that can be largely attributed to the fact that ESPN had one really solid game early in the year in week 2, and then had one really bad one just this past week. So that's a pretty good reason why. FX has averaged 466,000 viewers, ESPN2 546,000 viewers, and ESPN 520,000. My biggest takeaway for this is I was not as right as I was hoping to be about the TV stuff. Essentially, what we've seen between both the XFL and USFL is that the USFL does have the two best networks in Fox and NBC, but then the XFL has basically the next four: ABC, ESPN, ESPN2, and FX. Then the USFL is the bottom two in FS1 and USA. But the thing is, I really did think that ESPN would be really solid, but from at least what we're seeing, that's not the case. ESPN isn't proving to be better than ESPN2 or FX, and it's basically just proven to be the same. So even though the next few weeks there's very few FX games and a lot more in ESPN and then naturally ABC, I don't think these ESPN games are really going to get as many viewers as they should. The bottom line is, even with only 2 games, the ESPN games should be averaging more than ESPN2 and FX, and they're not. But I think that overall these ratings will go up due to ABC having games. Now, just a quick FYI, to those talking about ESPN Plus, I said this in my video talking about the schedule for the USFL. The streaming platforms are not as good as some people think. Yes, millions of people have ESPN Plus, but millions of those people don't use it because they only got it through Verizon deals or the Disney Plus Hulu bundle. And 3, no, people who have ESPN Plus are not always going to tune in to watch games on the XFL. If they're getting anything about 100,000, and I would say with how bad the ratings were this past week, 50,000, they would be talking about it. So for all intents and purposes, ESPN Plus is getting less than 50,000 viewers per game, and even that might be generous. But overall, these ratings should go up in the overall sense, as ABC should have some good games. If ABC doesn't crack 1 million games, that's not the end of the world, but it's not a great thing, and I don't think it will, and I'll talk about that more later. Now, for comparison's sake, the USFL during the same time had a couple different things. Number one, the USFL had a terrible idea, which they're not doing this year because unlike the XFL, the USFL learned from last year, and that's don't have Peacock exclusive games. Those were dumb ideas, and that's why there's only 14 games here instead of 16. So in terms of the USFL, the 2 games on FS1 averaged 315,000 viewers, though one of those games did have a really weird start due to baseball or something like that. NBC averaged 960,000 viewers in 3 games, USA averaged 300,000 viewers in 3 games, and Fox averaged 910,000 viewers in 6 games. This is basically what you should expect. USA and FS1 are not as good as the other 3 channels the XFL has, but if NBC and Fox are broadcast TV, they will get better views. And especially considering the fact that at this point during the season, those games are getting anywhere from 3 to 4 times more viewers than the games on last week. Essentially, week 5, if you look at the USFL versus the XFL games, they were averaging about 3 to 4 times more, which is kind of what you should have on broadcast. So not too big a surprise. But overall, I think that it's the fact the XFL doesn't have games on ABC, I think is going to hurt it a lot. And I think we're going to see that in the next couple weeks. But yeah. Now, in terms of attendance, this is a big deal. If you look online, basically the only major argument people who prefer the XFL have over the USFL is almost entirely just based on the fact that the USFL does not play in home stadiums. Now, the XFL does play in home stadiums, though really only the Renegades are a true home team. For those of you who don't know, every team basically just does everything in Arlington but play games. So even though they are playing in home stadiums, only the Renegades are actually a home team. No one else is. Versus the USFL, which is going to have 3 home teams this year in a sense. So that's just an FYI. In terms of the attendance, everything I'm going to say right now excludes the Battlehawks. Why? The Battlehawks are a fantastic, fantastic team. Their fans truly do love this team. I know that the deal I believe XFL has for like a couple years to have the hub in Arlington, but they need to get the Battlehawks to St. Louis ASAP and have them do everything there. Those fans are great. Think about it. They dropped 3,000 people from their first game to their second game. That was despite having an MLS game happen and despite March Madness happening. Those fans love them some Battlehawks, and that fan base is great. Aside from that, every team has been anywhere from a disappointment to a disaster. The Vipers, a disaster. Yes, they're consistent in averaging trash numbers in 6,000, which is in a large part due to, 1, they play at a terrible stadium in Cashman Field, and 2, ain't nobody really care about the Vipers because their team sucks, which I get to why they're so bad in a bit. And then we have the Sea Dragons, who have been the biggest disappointment. This is almost purely on the XFL's management. They've scheduled games horrifically for the Sea Dragons. Way too late start times, playing too many of them on Thursdays, having them compete with Kraken games. The XFL just did not bother to look at what a good time was for these games to happen. And so a team that in the XFL 2020 iteration averaged 25,000 across their 2 games they played, this team's best game was just over 15,000. Then we look at another team that's supposed to be an easy 20,000 in the Brahmas. The Brahmas had a very solid start at 24,000. I talked about that being a great start for them. Then we had their second game, which didn't even crack 14,000. That's bad. The San Antonio Commanders of the AAF averaged 27,000 fans per game, and their worst game was 23,000. Now, yes, a large part of that is also the team is really bad, but it's not a good look. Aside from them, every team has basically dropped off by a decent amount. Orlando's been pretty bad. They're down just about 7,000 to 8,000 from what they were. Yeah, they're down over 8,000 from what they were in the AAF. Then all the other teams are down anywhere from, like 3 to 5, they're down thousands. And in terms of averages, I don't have them up, but the XFL 3.0 is currently averaging less fans per game in an overall sense than either of the other 2 leagues, and that's despite the AAF having been viewed as being carried by the Commanders. This XFL is being carried purely by the Battlehawks. The Battlehawks in their second game, so their lower game of 35,000, is still better than the Renegades' total attendance, the Vipers' total attendance, the Guardians' total attendance, and the Sea Dragons' total attendance, which is horrific. Those are really bad. So attendance is looking to be really bad, and hopefully some of these teams improve. The Battlehawks, I expect them to get 30,000 the rest of the year. Great fan base. No matter what happens to the XFL, the Battlehawks do need to survive. But in terms of the other teams, they haven't been that great, and they need to really hope that a lot of these USFL teams, the Showboats, Panthers, and Stallions all have really bad numbers because the XFL 3.0's numbers outside of St. Louis have been very bad. Now, here's something I want to talk about. I talked about this a while ago when the coaches were announced. I said that these were terrible hires for the most part. I was proven right. And there's a lot of people on sites like Reddit talking about this too, how when they called the league out on this, they got, hate for it, but it was obvious. There are 4 coaches who have prior head coaching experience in the XFL and 4 that don't. These records are insane. The 4 that have prior experience, all are winning records, and combined for a 15-5 record. This is against the XFL head coaches who have no experience coaching, who combine for 5-15. 3 of those coaches combined for 2 wins. Anthony Becht is the lone winning coach, and that's also with having a couple insane victories at the last second. Whereas you look at Bob Stoops, for example, his offense can't do anything this whole season, and they're still 3-2. So you look at this and you realize that there's a big difference in coaching. This is a huge deal, as no matter what you say, the fact is that when you're watching these games from the XFL and USFL, coaching is proving to be the most important thing. I think also in the NFL, we're seeing more and more that if you look at an overall team, the head coach is the most important part of that team because he builds up the quality of players or builds them down. The fact is that the Vipers, the Brahmas, and the Guardians should not be this bad, but they are. We saw it last year in the USFL with Kirby Wilson being by far the worst coach, and he had by far the worst team. They had one fluky win on the whole season, and aside from that, they basically got crushed every game. We saw that. Now we're seeing this in the XFL. The XFL had terrible coaches hired, and they need to get rid of these guys. Hiring guys just because they have a name is not a good idea. You need good coaches. You need guys like Wade Phillips, Jim Haslett, Bob Stoops, Reggie Barlow, USFL's Kevin Sumlin last year. Getting John DeFilippo this year has some solid experiences being side coaches, as well as their big three, Mike Riley, Bart Andrus, Skip Holtz. Those are great coaches. Whereas the XFL, they didn't care really about getting great coaches. They got a couple of them. They didn't get a lot of them. And the fact is, when you look at these guys, most of the coaches they got without head coaching experience also don't have coaching experience. They basically didn't do anything. Anthony Becht was a tight ends coach in the AAF. That's all he's done. So you look at this, and it's very obvious why this is happening. So in terms of my final thoughts on this, I think that overall the XFL 3.0 is still being a overall success. It is not being the success that I think a lot of XFL fans hoped it was, as the fact is at this point, the USFL has it beat in a head-to-head sense, as the USFL had a lot less of this obviously bad teamage, as you could at least say that the gamblers were just bad because they were blowing games, but they didn't have half the league be basically unwatchable. I say half the league because, let's be honest, Stoops' team, they are pretty unwatchable. Their offense is just horrific. But when you look at it as well, their attendance has not been as good as they were hoping for sure. Now, the Battlehawks have been great, and I know that March Madness happened, but that's not an excuse for poor ratings. The USFL had to compete with two separate sports as playoffs. So, yeah. Now, the next review I'm going to have is going to probably be at the end of the year, or it'll be at the end of the season, like regular season, where we're going to have some head-to-head games between the USFL and XFL. I'm going to be very intrigued to see what those ratings are for those games, but I also want to just know what the next couple of weeks are. I'm going to be looking into that very heavily. I think the XFL really did shoot itself in the foot not having games on ABC, as you're not able to get the attention of as many casuals as you could if you had done it with games on broadcast from the beginning. Instead, you're hoping that you get all your hardcore fans to come in, and now you're hoping casuals join in, rather than allowing casuals to join in from the start. We'll see what overall happens in the next few weeks, but overall, in terms of the XFL 3.0 mid-season, if I were to give them a letter grade, I'd honestly probably give them a C, because they have some really high highs with the Battlehawks and their fans and their overall thing, and the fact that, at this point, the AAF was basically already, declaring bankruptcy pretty much. And the other XFL was, gone after this due to both monetary problems and COVID. But in terms of the TV ratings, they have been beating the poo-poo channels of FS1 and USA for the USFL, but their overall ratings are still not great when you compare them to the USFL due to the broadcast TV. I think that is a C grade, would be a fair grade if I were to give them a letter grade. But yeah, this has been Zomfox. If you enjoy this content, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell, and be on the lookout. My power rankings video for the USFL should be coming out in the next couple weeks, and I've been waiting, we should have the uniform reveals for the Maulers and Showboats coming soon. So, as always, have a great night.